if I give any advice, it's to challenge your own biases, read books that are typically not the books that you find yourself normally reading, read books that have different ideas. What the moment is happening now requires a lot of patience with people, and you've got to be patient if you want them to be able to support your cause.
Good day, Bradley.
Hello, Paulus.
How are you doing? Is it morning in the US?
It is. In Chicago, it is morning, and it should be early afternoon for you.
That is right. That is right. Thanks a lot for joining in today. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
For those who don't yet know who Bradley Morgan is, Bradley is an author of a book called U2's The Joshua Tree: Planting Roots in Mythic America. So, as the name of the book suggests, it's about U2's album The Joshua Tree. What encouraged you or what inspired you to write the book? As well, why have you titled the book in such a way?
Yes, so the book is about U2's 1987 seminal album, The Joshua Tree, which has the hits With or Without You, Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, but it's also not really about the album. It's a commentary on the American dichotomy, this concept of the promised land mythos that America is built upon versus the reality of it, where despite a lot of its promises that are a part of that myth, some of those have not been reality for a lot of marginalized members of American society. And so the idea of planting roots in Mythic America is, as I discuss through using the album as a lens, I discuss this idea of that there is a type of America we can work towards. It may be impossible, but it gives us a commonality to achieve, and that's an element that I've heard throughout the album. So I wrote the book exploring those themes, and so that's the idea of planting roots in Mythic America, is uniting under a common idea of trying to achieve that mythical idea of America where we have equality and equity for everyone.
Gotcha. And as I know, previously to writing this book, you have not published any other works of literature. So this was your first book, as I understand. Am I correct?
Yes, that is. I originally had written a blog post for a community radio station on the 30th anniversary of the Joshua Tree, and talking about the tour that the band did in support of that anniversary. And I discuss a lot of the ideas in just a smaller format for that. But then I had thoughts that this could, be something a lot more. So there's a very famous music book series called 33 and a Third, published by Bloomsbury. You can find those books in the US, in the UK, and Australia. They do some titles that are more regional. I think they have like a Japanese series as well. But it's a series where they authors will write about one particular album and you pitch it. And I kept pitching this, and it was not successfully accepted. So I had the manuscript already, and I thought, well, I think this is really good, so I'm just going to pitch it to other publishers. And it took a long time, being someone with no experience, but eventually I did land that. I necessarily didn't think that it was anything to do with the quality of the content, but as with anything, when you're trying to get it, it's about who you know. And so I had a much longer process for this, but it came out better for it.
Understood. So, what was your idea of writing a book prior to writing it, and how has it changed at the end of the process? Have you imagined the process of writing is going to be different from what it actually was? And if it was different, in what kind of ways?
Well, I'm not the kind of writer who's very prolific in the sense that I can just write about anything. I spend a lot of time thinking about deep cultural and social issues, often related to American politics. And I would not have written this book if Donald Trump was not elected, because the reason why this album circulated again in the way that it did 30 years after its release was that U2 had discovered that a lot of the themes that they had addressed in the album when it was initially recorded, as a response to Reagan's politics and a response to Thatcher's politics, that they found that a lot of the themes and ideas they addressed then were coming full circle again. It was becoming more relevant again, and that a lot of the ideas and politics of Trump's administration mirrored those. And so when I say that it, my book is about the album, but not about the album, it's a commentary on Trump's influence and that kind of conservative ideology's influence on American culture. And I wanted to really just talk about that. And when I started the book, my book was more focused on that. And then I had a friend say, you need to really write more about the music. And so I had to kind of find the balance of how to tell this commentary I wanted to and how it relates to the story. And so they're very much intertwined in this exploration of what this American mythos is.
And what were the methods that you used to write this book? How did you gather the information? How did you gather, so to say, the data that you later used in writing the chapters? What was your methodology?
I read a lot. I'd read a lot of, even before I even thought about ever writing a book, I read a lot of music books and I read a lot of books about um, current events and politics. And so it just kind of ingrained in me, you know, to how to mirror those two. And I think that's the best advice I can give for any writer. I know some say write every day. I don't, because I'm not that kind of writer and I'm not looking to be that kind of writer. But I just read a lot, and that really kind of, I think, innately on a subconscious level helped me figure out how I was going to tell the narrative flow of this. And so I said it very much of like introducing, like each chapter is focusing on a different song, but I'll talk about something that's particular to an event that has similar themes or more stronger connections to the songs, and then I kind of just it's almost like taking the reader on a journey. I'm not just breaking down in granular detail the recording process of a song or the history of it, but what are its themes, and do these themes kind of speak to larger ideas? And so, an example of that, and this might be a little dark, but it's part of the album. There's a song on the album called "Exit," and at that time, Bono and The Edge were reading a lot of books by American authors that are part of a movement in the 50s called the New Journalism Movement. This is where you see Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. This is where you see Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song, just people taking either real world incidents or fictionalized versions of this to kind of tell a commentary of America. And in this song, there is a type of dark figure. He's a preacher. He's kind of based on a character by Flannery O'Connor in the novel Wise Blood. I think the character's name is Hazel Motes, and it's this dark figure that's been very poisoned by this puritanical version of religion that's kind of wandering this dark desert landscape to go find a victim. And you kind of hear that in the music, the way that the music sounds. It sounds like a beating. Um, he captures a victim, and it's very dark and disturbing. And it's a commentary, as the song was written, it's a commentary about how people who need certain mental health treatments, who if they're lost in the margins of society where social services can't reach them, where um, public programs can't reach them, they can devolve further and further into this dark side of themselves to carry out this horrendous atrocity, this murder. And it sounds, I don't know how it sounds to people outside of America, but in the United States, we have a lot of school shootings and a lot of mass shootings committed
Yes.
by specifically very young white men. And so there's something about the society where there are troubled young white men who are committing these atrocities, who feel like they're not part of the American culture, who feel left behind, and this is the only way that they can, in their mind, seeks some sort of justice, seeks some sort of retribution. So I know that's a little bit dark. I don't know if you, but it's part of the narrative of the album. So I explored ideas like that. You know, this dark figure, what that meant to you two writing the song, and where they got that, versus where now do I see similarities. And one of those similarities is these young white men committing these mass atrocities.
That's fantastic. It's drawing parallels between, in 30 years of time, a lot of things have changed, looking at history and life in a linear fashion. But looking at it as a whole in a circular manner, you know that certain events tend to repeat themselves just in different kind of clothes, we could say. So there are tendencies that are universal and timeless, unfortunately, and not all of them are good. So even the book, even if the album was released 30 years ago, some of the points that it touched upon is still as relevant today. But for other people to make this kind of association, it's good that you manage to tell a story and to make your own interpretation of it. But the interpretation does not seem to be divorced from the meaning intended. Because what I really liked when I was reading through some of the comments on Amazon and on Goodreads relating to your book is that many people were very fond that the book was very well researched. So the research part shows that you went deep into the subject, into the objective part and your subjective reality of it as well, as a listener, as a person who experiences the album. But I also know that you, well, at least I guess, that you had to conduct interviews for the book as well. So am I correct on this point? Did you have to talk with the band members or people from their circle while you were writing this book?
No, I didn't talk to anyone writing this book. I tried to connect with a lot of people, and I was not able to. Part of that is because, as I was saying earlier, that I this is my first time. I'm no name. Bono is one of the most sought after people in the world, so there's no way I was ever going to talk to him. No, I got all my materials from the public library and just did the research from there. And I really liked hearing the comment from readers that it was very well researched, because my goal was not only to tell the story about this mythical America versus the reality of America, but to really champion the Joshua Tree as a work of art that comments on that. I found that a lot of people who weren't familiar with the album didn't necessarily see that in it, and so I wanted to raise this as a piece of art that over the course of U2's career, for a lot of people, may not have been so obvious. And so I had a bit of an agenda with that. So um, I wanted to be as well researched as possible because I wanted to be right. I didn't want anyone to tell me I was wrong. You know, I'm certainly can be proven wrong if someone comes up with, someone talks to Bono and says, this guy's book's terrible. But that was exactly the goal. And I think I accomplished it because I didn't want to. There's a lot of books on YouTube that are very much for fans, and I didn't want to write a fan book. I wanted to write a book where even if you knew absolutely nothing about who this band or this album was, that you were going to leave with a positive impression. And I talked to people who were, after the book was published and they read it, I talked to some people who were in college when that album came out, and they hadn't listened to it since then. They weren't necessarily fans, but after they read the book, because they were my friends and they read the book, they said they were left with a very positive impression. It definitely had changed that, and even the writer Gregor Meyer, who wrote the foreword to the book, he talks about how he was in college when that album came out, and he actually never even listened to it until I asked him to write the
Wow.
foreword. And when he was telling me that, I said, that's perfect. That's great. I want to kind of make sure that my points that I'm trying to make in this are very strong. So I gave him just the proposal. I didn't, which had like maybe a chapter or two, but I didn't give him the book at all. So he kind of understood what I was trying to look for, and then he went into the album on his own, and he came back with like, okay, I get it now.
Wow. Okay. And knowing that your first book I would call it a success because the people who have read it actually review it in a positive tone. They say that it was well researched, that it was interesting, that it touched upon a lot of themes that are important and relevant, especially in the US, but also in the world at large as well. So I would call it a success. And I wonder if you have considered writing another one. And if you consider writing another book, would it be on a similar topic relating to music, to a specific album or a band, or would it tilt another direction?
I'm currently writing a second book. I have no contract for it yet. I haven't really started pitching it, but I'm well into it, so I can only talk about limited details. But it is a music-oriented book where I'm discussing an artist's discography and finding ways in which, as their career progressed, their art evolved to comment and criticize on the people and policies that facilitate the rise of Christian fascism in the United States. And for listeners outside of the U.S. who may not be familiar with what I mean by in terms of Christian fascism, it's this type of very puritanical interpretation of Christianity that is prioritizes white people over and men. It's very it's a very misogynistic, it's very racist, it's very sexist, and even beyond that, it evolves its own ideology to even comment that Americans who were even born in this country but have liberal ideas, they're not real Americans, and so therefore they have to be, in some cases, gotten rid of. So it's a commentary on how an artist evolved that art despite critical and commercial pressures to not do it, continue to do it, and to accelerate and make it a whole part of their career, to say these people are very dangerous and they will not only take away your rights, they could possibly kill you.
Do you think there are any other groups that might be potentially dangerous to the wider society? And is this currently being addressed in other musicians' works as well?
I mean, there's a lot of dangerous extremist groups in the United States, and they're not necessarily all on on the conservative side. There are some on the liberal side, but they are the most active threat right now, because of how mobilized they are and how much influence they are gaining in the government. We now have several members of Congress who share similar views, and a lot, and their views are based on white supremacy, and essentially a Christian fascist is someone who, i- if you are not white and not American, and the thing in the not American can also apply to other Americans as well who just think differently. um, they think you have no place in this society. And there's a lot of great books out there that I've been using for my own research for this one, even from church leaders who talk about the danger of this. And the overall ideology of a Christian fascist is that they view that America is an existential battle for its own soul, that they are losing a sense of what it is to be American. They think America is at its final days. And so they're trying to coalesce support to figure out what exactly, like, how to change that. Like, to them, America's final days means this country's getting has a lot more non-white people in it, has a lot more liberal ideology, and in some extreme cases, they will take up arms to defend their vision of what they think America should be. Um, and I know that this is a conflict that tends to happen in a lot of other countries as well. This division of different ideologies, whether they be political or religious. And I know that's something that a lot of other countries deal with. The problem here in the United States, and perhaps why we it tends to be more of an issue here, is that all of that is built into the myth of America. This idea that the United States is a refuge and a home for all. It's built into the framework of our founding documents and the mythology from that. And of course, as we talked about the promised land versus reality, I mean, we had slavery for so long. Even after slavery ended, there was still Jim Crow legislation that kept Black people from being able to have actual rights. And until the 60s, even now, this is all still hotly debated, and it shouldn't be. I mean, everyone should have rights. But I think what makes it a little more complex is that it's baked into America since its founding, and I'm someone who believes in a pluralistic society. I mean, there's a lot of things I see in this country I don't like and I don't believe in, and but I'm not going to get a gun and shoot those people. It's not it's not what's going to happen. But there is a type of sickness in American culture that has been ongoing for since the early 1900s that has evolved this. Certainly in before America's involvement in World War II, there was a lot of pro-Nazi groups that gained popularity in the United States. And even in the 1950s, a lot of the current very extremist right wing conservative ideology we see with Christian fascists now comes from uh, at that time, a secret organization in the 50s called the John Birch Society. And they're the ones that kind of proposed this, very white Protestant Christian version of America as being like the right, correct version of America. And that has that's had the most direct influence on what we have now.
Well, it's very interesting that you weaved two passions that you have, which is a passion for history and politics and sociology, let's say, social studies on one department, and your passion for music in another department, and you connected these two, through writing. Of course, they are already connected in the music about which you're writing, but it's a very nice way of combining these two things to make it more approachable for many people. Because technical books, let's say historical, political books with big words, tend to be a little bit, we could say, not for everyone. It's not for everyone's liking, and sometimes it's not for everyone's reading capacity. But if you connect it with music, and music is very approachable for everyone, it opens up the same ideas to a broader audience. So I wonder, is this was this a conscious thing, or it just happened that that's how you express your concerns and ideas about politics through writing about music?
Well, so we're talking about this unnamed project that's not picked up yet, but it's something that I did put in a lot of for my YouTube book, not necessarily more, uh, not necessarily in very stark or language that really showcases that this is a very immediate problem. In the YouTube book, I talk about that dichotomy of America, and it is fueled by white Christian nationalism and and Christian fascism. And but it's in there, but it's not so prevalent. And the reason why is because I'm trying to, with that book, unite under this vision I found through the album of, okay, there's this mythical version of America that's never been real and it never will be real, but it's at least something to work towards. And that's, I wanted to hold that into the highest, above the music, above everything else. That's ultimately what I try to communicate through this book. And the Joshua Tree, it was the method to do that. With this other one, it is more of like, we have an immediate problem here because we are facing an existential crisis in the United States in terms of our democracy. I mean, there are people. I mean, the U.S. Capitol building had an insurrection seized against it in January 6, 2021, where a whole group of white Christian nationalists were mobilized by the sitting president to go and interfere with a free and fair election. I mean, that's where we're at right now. And the artist who I want to convey that is a very difficult artist, but he's also one of the most prolific in terms of communicating that idea. But because of its difficulty, this gets in the hand of like another issue that I want to address, which is cultural authoritarianism, and it's this idea that I've been seeing come up with a lot of very extremist leftist people, um, where if they don't feel like they see the value in this particular art, it's therefore bad. We should get rid of it. And I'm trying to use a difficult artist to bring up this idea that, like, look, we're facing, like, democracy might be gone. Okay, could we just find whatever thread of commentary we can about the importance of upholding democracy until we get through this? That's ultimately what I'm going through with this project. And I wish I could talk about it more, but I don't have a publisher yet. So but I think I've left enough clues that if your listeners really were curious, they could find out who I'm talking about. The man is no longer alive. He hasn't been alive for 30 years, but despite him being gone for 30 years, I think his message is very, very important.
That is fantastic. That's something for the listeners to look forward to, and for me as well. And of course, I will link your contact details and the link towards your book, the one that has already been published. And for those who are curious, they will be able to find it whenever it's out. But I also know that you conduct a podcast of your own. What kind of topics do you talk about in your podcast?
So the podcast I'm on the podcast. It's not my podcast, but it's a podcast network called the New Books Network, and it's a consortium of authors who interview other authors for academic purposes. And we have the main podcast feed for New Books Network, but we have all these sub feeds that pertain to particular academic interests. You could have British studies, media studies, women's studies, gender studies, all any kind of academic discipline you could think of. We have a channel for that. We even have a genocide studies channel for people who write books on
Wow.
that topic. So I interview authors of contemporary and popular music books, and I try to be very diverse with my with the choices that I make with that. I mean, we have some people on the network who they interview what they know and what's their strengths. For me, it's an opportunity for me to learn to elevate an author whose work I think is very good, and to introduce interesting ideas. And so I've interviewed some of the recent interviews I did. Some of them could be more biographical. I interviewed, there's a really great music writer named Annie Zaleski, who I interviewed for her on her Lady Gaga book. And so we talk about Lady Gaga. Um, but I also do get a little bit deeper. I interviewed a professor from the University of Toronto named Hugh Hodges, who wrote a book called The Fascist Groove Thing. And it's a history of Margaret Thatcher's premiership told through tw 21 playlists that he organized using 400 songs, because he realized in his research that you could tell the entire history of Thatcher's time as prime minister just through song titles. So he organized all these playlists that pertain to, like, oh, here's a playlist on Thatcher's involvement with police, or here's a playlist on the Falkland War, or here's a playlist on her economic policies. And so he tells that story through the music, and it's really fascinating.
And as well, I'm glad that you mentioned the far left as well. So there are troubles in the far right and the far left. So we don't want just to hit upon the far right, because of course it's problematic, definitely, but so is the other side of the problem. So it seems that people really enjoy going to the extremes, whatever extreme it might be, and kind of taking this really black or white, 0 and 1, yes and no, dark and night approach. Maybe it's a way to simplify the world and to lash on some kind of an idea that if we continue doing this, everything is going to be resolved. But of course, life is much more complex. It has many more variables than that. So I wonder, observing the social reality in the US and also maybe outside of it, do you think that this kind of really simplified way of thinking about real problems that, let's say, your country or the world in general is feeling, does this resolve in these kind of extremisms, or is it something else?
Yes, so I think that answer is going to vary depending on what period we're looking at. But if we're looking at right now at this current moment, I blame the internet and social media. I'm a progressive leftist and I align with a lot of very leftist ideas, but I'm really disturbed by the methodology in a lot of cases. I'm very much for bridging gaps, bridging that divide, and working with people to change their hearts and minds as opposed to doing it through sheer force. Um, and with the internet, there's a lot of complex social things that have happened that happen naturally that we see happening at much increased rates. At what's happening much faster and a lot more. And a lot of social change takes a long time. And so when you've got the instant gratification effect of social media, I think it's poisoning people's minds to demand everything right now. And certainly, I mean, if you're trying to, if you're on not, I don't, maybe not extremist, but if you are not close to the middle of any political spectrum, your goal is to try to motivate these people in the middle to go to your sides. They have a much more, I don't want, in the US, we say the middle tends to have more of a common sense. I think that sometimes can be a little bit insulting. But these are people who might understand both sides, but you've got to try to appeal them. You catch more flies with honey than you do vinegar, as the saying goes.
Hmm.
And what I'm finding also with that is part of that is that there are governments and forces, um, online internet trolls that have a vested interest in the chaos that they're creating. I mean, certainly Brexit, I read books that tied Brexit to Putin, that the reason why that was able to be facilitated was because of his interference with that using troll farms in, I think, Romania, where you're paying people
Hmm.
very, very slave wages to, overthrow, you know, democracy using grassroots efforts. And I think a lot about what's been kind of been a guiding principle for me is I think a lot about what I read several years ago in a memoir by Congressman Barney Frank. And for listeners, Barney Frank was a congressman from Massachusetts in the late 80s. He was elected in the late 80s. And he was the first openly gay member of Congress, and he was a champion for LGBT rights, champion for all of that. And he talks about two criticisms that he received throughout that. The first was that he spent a lot of time with gay and lesbian people, telling them how to act and how not to act. And so, like, if you think of going to a pride parade now, he wanted back in the late 80s, early 90s for people to dress very conservatively, very normally, because you're trying to change the mind of these people in the middle of the political spectrum. And if you dress in a very provocative way, you're only going to hurt your cause. And I understand the criticism for that, but he was thinking more in terms of the long term, you know, because they're not going to just change their minds overnight. So he got a lot of criticism for telling people how to behave. And I think he was right to do that because you don't want to shock people. And the other criticism he gets is he did not advocate for transgender rights the same degree that he did for gay and lesbian rights. And that was for the same idea as well, that, we already have to try to convince millions of people that gay and lesbian people are normal members of society. Transgender people are absolutely should be respected members of society, but that's a much harder sell. And I know that sounds terrible, but if we think about it from like,
But that's the reality.
it's the reality. And right now in 2023 in the United States, I mean, there are several states that are passing anti-transgender legislation that's absolutely horrible. And you know, this is 35 years later than when that man was doing that work, when Barney Frank was doing that work. And I think he had the right. viewpoint on that. And when we think about how fast information can move through social media, um, I think it's tending to warp people's minds and creating this instant gratification element where they're demanding everything right now. And I when I
Yeah, I
dig a
get
little
it.
deeper into that and I talk to them further about that and I say, well, it is a long game. You have to do a lot of work to change people's hearts and minds. There's also a type of cynicism and nihilism I keep hearing pop up from that, and a lot of that is related to the threat of climate change. And because what I hear is when I start trying to break down exactly what they're thinking, like, well, the world's going to end in 20, 30 years anyway, so who cares? So it's like, okay, so
Wow.
like,
Okay.
so there's a type of cynicism and nihilism that I just have no place for. Um, I know things are going to get better. They're going to get a lot worse first, but they will get better, and I have to believe that. And uh, you have to react to the moment, and what the moment is happening now requires a lot of patience with people, and you've got to be patient if you want them to be able to support your cause.
And also, you have to be strategic because when we read in history books about Mahatma Gandhi or any other great leader that tried to make a change through, let's say, nonviolent actions, just like Martin Luther King Jr., people think that, well, oh, it was just passion and that's it. But no, those people were highly strategical about their approach. They planned ahead, they made moves, they played chess, and sometimes they used techniques that would be considered wrong in some ways, although they ended up in the right way. So it's a game that people should play while having the end goal in mind. Of course, not saying that you can have any means to achieve your goals. That's not the idea, but the idea is you have to think and plan long term and take in many different kind of complex variables into consideration. It's not like we will just do this and we will blame this group for everything, and after that group is gone, everything else is going to be okay. And that group could be like a myriad of other smaller assets. So of course this is a great worry, and I hope that the humanity at large has enough consciousness and has enough capacity to reason and think broad term, and we will eventually not end up in this kind of bad situation that it seems it could be going.
I'm really glad you touched upon that, because this is something that I explore in my YouTube book, where in the final essay I talk about what this album means to me, and what the Trump administration and my thoughts on the effects of that administration are. And I talk about how every American has an inherent responsibility to make this the country that they want it to be. Now, if we get into the particular details of, you know, what that responsibility may be, it's going to be very different. My responsibility as a millennial cisgender white man is going to be a lot different than that of an elderly black woman or a younger gay man. It's all going to be different. And the reason why it's different is because those are, marginalized communities who have had more have experienced more negative consequences of America's failings than I arguably have. And so that puts on me more responsibility to make sure that those systems that further that marginalization are not there. Um, but it's not something where I don't think anyone in the United States can just wash their hands and say, well, this is not my responsibility. I'm not thinking. We all have a responsibility, and there is a culpability, and we have to be able to kind of contribute to that in our own ways.
Well, that's lovely. That's a lovely idea to have that. We should bear our own responsibility and not put it on, let's say, institutions or anything else. It's we impact our surroundings much more than we can imagine, actually. So, taking personal responsibility first is the way we can actually do a lot. And of course, working on a larger scale, that's important. That's part of the personal responsibility. So, Bradley, I'm really, really glad that you had the time and had the willingness and patience to join in and talk about your books, as well as to discuss some topics that the listeners might not have expected to listen to. But I'm really glad that we went into them.
Well, thank you for having me. And because you know, as far as like process goes for writing, you know, I don't have a lot of advice other than just to read. I know other writers will tell you to write every day or go through these exercises just to get in the habit, and that's great. I mean, building habits is very important. If I give any advice, it's to challenge your own biases, read books that are typically not the books that you find yourself normally reading, read books that have different ideas, and really push yourself. And the caveat is that of course that all sounds well and good, but there's a lot of like trolls out there who use like free speech as a kind of way to push forward bad ideas, but we know what those bad ideas are. If
That's true.
anything, if there's any idea where the result is the subjugation of another human being, that's a bad idea. That person has no merit in what they're saying, you know. But if you feel like you're right all the time, read a book by someone who doesn't think you're right, and you can do the research on who is a trusted voice on that, you know. But they're out there, and that's the only way I think we can move forward is by testing our own prejudices and biases. And that's the work that I try to do with my writing, is to speak to the cultural moment, talk about what's happening now, and how we could potentially think about ideas that could reverse it. I mean, I don't have all the answers. I mean, you're not going to find the answers to America's problems with my YouTube book or this future book, but it's meant to plant seeds. It's meant to focus on patterns where if you read something that I wrote and you see elements of that elsewhere, I I, I think then the world's going to start opening up, and you'll be able to see how this common thread throughout. I mean, I don't. I guess everything. That's what I'm just trying to plant seeds on these larger ideas that I think are very important.
Wonderful. And I hope that once your second book is out, we can get you on the podcast once more and see what new ideas we should plant or what new seeds we should nurture. So we can open our perspective and try to see the bigger picture of the situation.
Well, thank you so much, Paulus.
Until next time, thanks, Bradley.